Video games are a big old magic trick. Sorry, illusion. Sleight of hand. Video games do stuff that isn't exactly, well, straightforward in order to sell the image. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 tricks games use to fool you. Starting off with number 10, in scripted moments when games dynamically adjust the animations depending on your speed. You know those big set piece moments in games where everything's crumbling, but you manage to escape at the last possible second? There's a lot of ways to go about trying to create these moments. Sometimes you have strict timing, so the only way you'll get through them is at the last possible second. But that can be frustrating. It can kill the momentum of a game if you're repeating a scripted section of a game over and over. And these days, most games just fake it. As described by Kurt Marginaw, Naughty Dog developed a technique where they would work backwards from the final jump and make it so the timing on the entire event would change depending on how quickly you're getting through it, which allows the event to be a lot more forgiving than it normally would be, while still ending at the perfect time. Naughty Dog and Insomniac are kind of the masters of this sort of thing. It can sometimes be pretty difficult to notice the game is slowing down, while with other games, it's not so seamless, let's just say. Among other things, they mentioned the train falling off the cliff segment in the original Uncharted 2 as the place where this started. If you look close enough, you can see it happening all over the place. In pretty much any Sony game with scripted moments. Like, I'm guessing that became standard practice for internal developers at Sony across the board. And number 9 is instructive level design. One of the more benign tricks of game design is the way games attempt to naturally introduce concepts and challenges in a low-pressure environment as a way for the player to naturally grow accustomed to these obstacles before throwing the player into the proverbial deep end. It's one of those game design concepts you never really notice until you hear about, then you see it everywhere. It's reading the Matrix code, basically. It's been in games as far back as Mario Brothers in '85, back when games didn't even allow for in-game tutorials, and not because it was some rule or something, it's just technology made it so if you did have a tutorial, it would just be impossibly bad. So they had to teach the players through level design. The game introduces the question mark blocks and your first enemy at the same time with nothing else present, and it makes it easy for new players to experiment and learn as you jump into a box, jump onto a Goomba. Take pretty much any level from Super Mario Wonder. They all work like this too. A new level gimmick is introduced in a relatively safe space for players. They can easily engage with it, learn to understand it, then the game ramps it the hell up. Hell, Elden Ring does this. As you know, Elden Ring starts off with a question mark box and a Goomba right there. No, I'm joking. A lot of the time, the first time you encounter an enemy, they're by themselves in a large area. That's what I'm talking about. There's no Goombas and question mark boxes that I am aware of in Elden Ring. But there's plenty of opportunities to understand how stuff works before you have to fight an enemy in a larger area, for instance. It's not necessarily a deception, and it's also maybe a positive thing. That said, it's really easy to ignore it or overlook it. So when you start noticing it everywhere, it's the green matrix code falling from the top of the screen. You're like, ah! At number 8 is tricks of scale. Scale in video games can be very weird. There's no real depth perception in games, so it can be hard to tell just how close or far away something is. And game designers use that to their advantage. Take a game like Halo, set in these large open environments. Somehow they managed to make weapons stand out from the rest of the world, and then just took this one little trick. Listen, I'm putting this here because this amazing picture posted on Reddit by AdTerma THXC7. I don't know which of those letters are supposed to be numbers. I'm not from Rome, but credit goes to that person, and it reveals the horrible truth. When weapons are on the ground, they're scaled up to be bigger so that they're easier to spot. In comparison, it looks absurd. That is a huge pistol, which that's what she said. Did you notice, though? I didn't notice. I never have. I've been playing these games since the original Xbox. Combat evolved. It's one of those little changes that if it were real life, it'd be super obvious. But because it's a video game, I never noticed. They tricked me. And honestly, it makes the game better for it. And number 7, the many tricks they use to make anime characters 3D. A lot has been said about Arc System Works' approach to animating their fighting games like Guilty Gear and Dragon Ball FighterZ. But even if you're aware of the way these games intentionally animate the way a drawn cartoon character would rather than a 3D animation, it doesn't properly convey just how much these games have to cheat to make their animations look as anime as possible. There's obvious stuff like anytime a character is shown at a side angle, their mouth is literally moved to the side of their face to make it look right. But the proportions of these characters can be wild, all over the place, to create all those recognizable poses and animations. Take any moment in a fighting game where the character pulls their fist up to the screen. It may look totally natural from the screen perspective, but at any different angle, everything about it is totally nuts. It's just, look at this. The game's making their fist look 3 times bigger, so the pose looks more dynamic and like how it's drawn in anime. Even something as basic as a simple facial expression can look perfect at the correct angle, but completely deranged and messed up from another. The amount of work these guys put in to make a 3D model animate like a 2D cartoon, it's amazing, and it's honestly like kind of magic. And number 6 is space. Going into space in any video game requires a lot of trickery. Doesn't matter what game you're looking at, but for Starfield to do it, they really had to stretch the creation engine. Because, you know, it's an engine that was made in 1999. On a previous list, I mentioned how they managed to make a train work in Fallout 3 by making it a hat for an NPC. The tricks to get Starfield into space aren't quite that out there, but they required some pretty creative problem solving from the developers. So in Starfield, how does space work? Well, when you're in space, you're really in a zone the game generates based off your location. It generates the planets as celestial objects in the sky to match where you appear to be on the space map. What's interesting about space is basically a big box around your ship, but the actual space part is just an illusion. If you take your character and cheat your way outside your ship, you'll just keep falling until you hit the edge of the map. That's the interesting thing about this whole thing. You can touch the edge of the map as your character, but if you're flying, the ship can just go on forever.
Some food. If you want to come on over, just pop on by.
I'm not 100% certain exactly how it works, but it's likely that your ship is the center and everything else moves around it. That's why if you're flying, it's actually possible to fly to other planets without going into a loading screen. The planets themselves aren't solid objects, however, they're basically just window dressing. But when you're actually flying around, the illusion it's pretty convincing. At number 5, the illusion of movement. In video games, there's a lot of moments where you seem like you're moving, but you're really not. It's everything else that's actually in motion. It may be how the previous point actually works. Not the case in every game. A lot of them actually do have moving through some form of environment, but there's a lot where your character is the fixed variable and everything else moves around them. As an example, a game like Hades doesn't always have this happen, but there's a part where you're riding a ferry and the ship doesn't actually move, it's the islands around it. It's primarily an engine solution so they can work around the issue of moving something while your character's standing on it. But in other games, the issues are a little more fundamental. Take The Outer Wilds. It's a game that's full of complex physics simulations. You might assume the only stationary object in the world is the sun, but that's actually not the case. It's also moving. The actual stationary point is your character. Everything revolves around you in this game. The reason is your character needs to be at the center of the world's coordinate space, literally 0, 0, 0. Otherwise, all these physics simulations start running in floating point errors and causes stuttering and performance errors, stuff like that. So, for example, when you jump in Outer Wilds, you're not actually moving. The planet goes down under you and then comes back again. It's kind of mind-bending to think about, but in practice, you'll never notice because it comes off not like that. At number 4, online multiplayer is basically one big trick. The big misconception is that you're playing with other people, and you're not really. Now, I'm not saying I'm an expert, but maybe let me explain it a little bit better. It doesn't matter how fast connection speeds are. It's not possible for games to completely accurately send all player data, all shooting trajectories, all that stuff at all times in split seconds between hundreds of players. So the game actually sends the absolute minimum amount of information possible, and then that's translated in gameplay on there. And I'm not necessarily the best at explaining this. I'm going to quote a Reddit post from the Me channel theme, which I think accurately illustrates what's going on. If it's a 24-player lobby, there's 24 different games in progress concurrently, 25 in a client server model. Your own actions affect other people's games and theirs affect yours, but ultimately they're separate experiences. Each client has its own reality, populated by one player and 23 slave puppets trying to match other players as best they can. And once you understand this, like, most online errors start to make perfect sense. It's a somewhat asynchronous experience. Ultimately, when people talk about good netcode, they don't mean games that manage to connect players better. What they really mean is that the game is just better at guessing. It just shows how incredibly complex coding an online game can be. And while I'm really only scratching the surface here, it's fascinating looking at the crazy tricks programmers have pulled off to make their online games more fun and responsive. And number 3, in-game shadow bans. If you're put a leaderboard in a game, people are going to cheat to get to the top. Doesn't matter how pointless the leaderboard is or how underplayed the game is, there's somebody that's going to cheat to get to the top. Tons of games have these kind of problems, but at least one developer on Reddit came up with a pretty novel solution. A post by the user Karma Adjuster. Their game pulled a little trick on cheaters. They had software to detect if a score had been cheated, but instead of banning the player, they hid the fraudulent high scores from legitimate players' leaderboards, effectively shadow banning them. The dev mentioned something that if you ban them, it's likely they'll just come back with more sophisticated cheats, but if you just hide their scores from everyone else, they'll keep going just thinking everything's fine. It's a clever idea. Shame the dev never actually revealed what game the trick was used in, but I guess that would kind of defeat the purpose of the shadow ban if everybody knew about it. And number 2 is bizarre ways games transform your character. It's one of those kinds of tricks games do all the time in the background simply because it's easier than the alternative. In a lot of games, instead of just going through the trouble of making a new model or modifying existing assets, they sort of just jam things together because the player's never going to see it. So when you do get people to look behind the curtain, like with the channel boundary break, you can find some pretty bizarre stuff, like how Mario uses the cannon box in Mario 3D World. Like, look at this. This is actually what the game does. It shrinks Mario's head and arms so they're ridiculously small in order to hide them while you're using the cannon. I'm not sure what I expected, but it wasn't this. Games do this sort of thing all the time, but you rarely get the opportunity to see it. And number 2, 2D games, when they're actually 3D. There have been a lot of throwback 2D games that look totally legit. You would never in a million years suspect anything from looking at them. But if you take control of the camera and get a peek behind the curtain, you can see the awful truth. These are not 2D games at all. I mean, it's not really an awful truth, but it's kind of surprising. A lot of games are like this too, but the ones that surprise me the most are Cuphead and Shovel Knight. These games don't have 3D elements in them, yet here they are. The reason for this is simple, of course. The engines used for these games are primarily for 3D games, but they offer more options than something that's a purely 2D engine, so they use what they have. In Cuphead, a lot of the elements are projected onto a single surface, but with Shovel Knight, all the different assets are separate, and it makes the game look like a shadow box or something. It's actually pretty cool. I'm surprised they never used it anywhere, but I guess Yacht Club Games wanted to stay as authentic to 8-bit as they could. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on GameRanx.